In the summer of 1789, America came dangerously close to starving. Not because crops failed, not because ships stopped arriving, not because an enemy army marched on its cities. It happened for a quieter reason. The smallest piece of money in America stopped working. A penny. There were no crashing stock charts, no collapsing banks, no dramatic headlines that would later fill history books. Yet for the people living through it, this crisis felt more immediate than war. Because when money fails, it doesn't attack armies, it attacks kitchens. Imagine waking up and discovering that the coins you earned yesterday no longer buy bread. By noon, they buy less. By evening, they buy nothing at all. Shopkeepers refuse them. Bakers push them back across the counter. Farmers turn their wagons around rather than accept them. Your money still exists, but no one trusts it. That is the most dangerous moment in any economy. This is the story of America's first financial crisis, and unlike later crashes driven by debt, speculation, or bubbles, this one was driven by something far more primitive: too much bad money. In April of 1789, George Washington stood on the balcony of Federal Hall in New York City and took the oath of office as the first president of the United States. The Constitution had just been ratified. The Revolutionary War was finally over. The grand experiment had begun. From above, the scene looked hopeful. A busy port, merchants shouting, ships crowding the harbor, a capital city alive with promise. But down at street level, something was already going wrong. Within months, shopkeepers would sweep money into gutters like trash. Bakers would refuse to sell bread to working men. Riots would break out in open-air food markets. Foreign diplomats would quietly step over piles of discarded copper coins on their way to Congress. New York City, the temporary capital of the United States, became the epicenter of a monetary disaster. And the cause was not foreign, it was not natural, it was not accidental. It was a secret, industrial-scale counterfeiting operation hidden in the woods of New York. To understand how a penny nearly broke the American Republic, you have to understand what money actually looked like in America after the Revolution. Because in the 1780s, American money was chaos. The war had bankrupted the government. The continental dollar had collapsed into worthlessness. Not worth a continental had become a national joke. Most importantly, the federal government did not control the money supply. Under the Articles of Confederation, the United States had no unified currency. There was no federal mint, no national standard, no effective enforcement. Each state was allowed to mint its own coins, and that decision would prove catastrophic. The wealthy barely noticed the problem. Merchants and financiers dealt in Spanish silver dollars and gold coins imported from Europe. Large transactions moved through ledgers, credit, and trust networks. But the average American lived in a completely different world. The farmer, the dock worker, the soldier, the laborer, they almost never saw gold. Their economy ran on copper. Copper coins paid wages. Copper coins bought bread, beer, candles, and tools. Copper coins were how daily life functioned. Most of these coins weren't even American. British halfpennies circulated freely and were widely trusted. On top of that, states like Connecticut, New Jersey, Vermont, and Massachusetts began minting their own copper coins to keep commerce moving.
The system was chaotic, but for a while it worked, until someone realized how easy it was to exploit. His name was Thomas Machen. Machen was not a criminal in the way people usually imagine criminals. He wasn't desperate, he wasn't reckless, and he wasn't an outsider. He was a patriot. During the Revolutionary War, Machen had been a celebrated engineer. He designed the massive iron chain stretched across the Hudson River at West Point, a feat of engineering meant to stop British warships from advancing upriver. The chain worked. It helped protect the American interior. and it made Machen famous. When the war ended, he emerged with a reputation as a mechanical genius and a loyal son of the revolution. But peace is often harder than war. Military contracts disappeared. Demand for engineering collapsed. The country was flooded with veterans, unpaid soldiers, and idle craftsmen. Opportunity was scarce. Cash was scarcer. Machen understood machines. He understood metal. And more importantly, he understood something most people did not yet grasp. Money itself was a machine, and like any machine, it could be optimized. In 1787, Machen formed a quiet partnership with several wealthy investors. Together, they built a facility near Newburgh, New York. Officially, it was a grist mill. Inside, it was something else entirely. Hidden from public view, Machen installed advanced minting equipment, presses capable of striking thousands of coins, precision tools designed for speed and consistency. This place would later be known as Machen's Mills, and it would nearly destroy the American economy. Machen's first move was subtle and brilliant. He didn't introduce a new coin. He copied an old one. British halfpennies were still legal tender in America. They were trusted, and most people had never seen a brand new example. The coins in circulation were dark, scratched, uneven, and worn by decades of use. Machen realized something crucial. If a coin looked old, people assumed it was real. So he minted thousands of brand new copper coins that were slightly lighter than the official British standard. Each coin saved him copper. Each coin increased his profit. Then came the masterstroke. Machen dumped the coins into barrels filled with acid, sand, and sawdust. He churned them violently. He scarred them. He darkened them. When they emerged, they looked exactly like decades-old British halfpennies. Dirty, worn, authentic. They passed effortlessly. This was not basement counterfeiting. This was industrial production. Machen wasn't clipping coins or filing edges. He was manufacturing money at scale. And at first, no one noticed. Commerce seemed to boom. There was cash everywhere. Wages were paid. Markets buzzed. People felt richer, even if they couldn't explain why. But money behaves like water. Add too much, and everything floods. By 1788, Machen expanded the operation. He struck official contracts with states like Vermont and Connecticut to mint legitimate copper coins. These contracts gave him cover. While producing authorized coins, he quietly overproduced millions of unauthorized lightweight coppers. They flowed outward like a slow toxin. New York, New Jersey, Connecticut. By early 1789, the volume of copper in circulation reached a critical mass. Merchants began to sense something was wrong. Their tills were full, but their wealth wasn't growing. They had barrels of pennies that no one wanted to accept at full value. That's when an old economic rule snapped into place.
Machen's coins were lighter, so people spent them first. The heavier, higher quality coins disappeared into hoards. The circulating currency became almost entirely trash. Trust cracked. And once trust cracks, collapse follows. When money collapses, it doesn't do so politely. It doesn't ring a bell. It doesn't announce a date. It spreads. Slowly at first, then all at once. By the spring of 1789, merchants in New York City began to notice a pattern they couldn't ignore. Their drawers were overflowing with copper. Their shelves were emptying, and every transaction felt wrong. They were accepting pennies at face value, but the metal inside those pennies wasn't worth what it claimed to be. At first, the problem was subtle. A shopkeeper might notice that a handful of coins felt lighter than usual. A merchant might quietly set aside heavier coins and pass along the lighter ones. No one wanted to be the last person holding bad money. Then the newspapers noticed. Reports began circulating that the copper coins flooding the city were vile, spurious, and dangerously debased. Whispers turned into warnings, warnings turned into panic. Trust evaporated. The collapse didn't begin with bankers or politicians. It began with bakers. In July of 1789, New York City bakers announced they would no longer accept copper at the traditional rate of 14 pennies to the shilling. They demanded 20, then 24, then 40. Prices exploded, not because bread was scarce, but because money was failing. For the working poor, the effect was immediate and brutal. A laborer paid his wages in copper woke up one morning able to buy bread. By noon, he could buy less. By evening, he could buy nothing. Families went hungry in a city full of food. The baker was blamed. The merchant was blamed. But neither had caused the problem. Every copper accepted was a loss. Every sale was a gamble. Soon, farmers stopped coming. Why haul produce into the city if payment came in worthless metal? Wagons turned around at the outskirts. Market stalls sat empty. Supply chains snapped. The irony was devastating. Food existed. Labor existed. Demand existed. But exchange, the simple act of trade, had become impossible. Money had failed at its most basic job. Riots began breaking out in open-air markets. Crowds gathered, voices rose, accusations flew. Bakers were shouted down. Merchants were accused of hoarding. The poor accused the rich hid behind silver. Yet beneath the anger was something more dangerous than hunger: humiliation. People had worked, they had been paid, they had followed the rules, and still they couldn't eat. Above it all stood the brand new federal government, barely assembled and already powerless. The first Congress had arrived in New York City to build a nation. Instead, they found a population that couldn't buy bread. Senators walking to work stepped over piles of discarded copper coins in the gutter. Pennies swept aside like dirt. Foreign diplomats noticed, quietly, with raised eyebrows. This was supposed to be the triumph of Republican self-government. Instead, the capital city couldn't maintain a functioning market. The political damage was severe. Opponents of the Constitution had warned that the new government would be weak, that it would fail to maintain order, that centralized authority was either dangerous or useless. Now, the Federalists looked helpless.
They commanded an army, they commanded courts, but they couldn't guarantee that a soldier could buy a loaf of bread. The question hanging over the city was terrifyingly simple: who controlled the money? Under the Articles of Confederation, states had retained the right to coin money. What once seemed like a safeguard of liberty now looked like insanity. One corrupt mint in one state could poison every neighboring economy. Money didn't respect borders. Bad copper from New Jersey flooded New York. Bad copper from Connecticut crossed state lines effortlessly. The weakest link dragged everyone down. State governments panicked. New York rushed through emergency legislation regulating copper coins. Officials tried to ban lightweight coppers outright, declaring them illegal tender. But you cannot ban a panic. By outlawing the bad coins, the state effectively criminalized the savings of thousands of people. Pennies that had been legal yesterday became worthless today. Enforcement was impossible. Confusion reigned. The law didn't restore trust. It shattered it further. Merchants refused all copper. Markets froze completely. Behind the scenes, the truth was becoming impossible to ignore. For 2 years, a single operation had pumped counterfeit and debased copper into the economy like a slow poison. Thomas Machen's mills had done their work too well. By the time officials understood what was happening, it was already too late. This was the moment where many financial crises end with a rescue. This one didn't. There was no central bank powerful enough to intervene, no federal mint to replace the currency, no emergency reserves to deploy. So the market did something radical. It abandoned metal. In Philadelphia, watching the carnage unfold in New York, the Bank of North America made a desperate decision. If copper could not be trusted, it would be bypassed. They issued paper notes for small change, 1 penny, 2 pennies, 3 pennies. At the time, this was revolutionary. Paper money carried deep scars in America. The memory of the worthless continental dollar was still fresh. Paper was associated with war, inflation, and fraud. But desperation changes beliefs. The public hated the copper so much that they accepted paper gladly. Thin slips of printed promise replaced heavy, worthless metal. The notes circulated smoothly. Markets stabilized, at least locally. The copper panic had forced Americans to do something they swore they would never do: trust paper. It was not a permanent solution. Everyone knew it. A great nation could not run on scraps issued by a private bank. But the experiment proved something essential. Money was not metal. It was trust. And once that truth became visible, everything changed. As for Machen, his operation eventually drew scrutiny. His mills were shut down quietly. There was no dramatic arrest, no public execution, no grand reckoning. Technically, he had operated in a legal gray zone, shielded by state contracts, vague laws, and poor enforcement. He retired wealthy, and the nation paid the price. By the end of 1789, one idea had died completely: the idea that money could be a private enterprise. The copper panic had demonstrated painfully that leaving the currency to states and contractors was a suicide pact. The system did not fail slowly. It failed catastrophically, and it failed first for those with the least. Out of hunger, riots, and humiliation, a new consensus began to form. If the United States was going to survive, it needed one money, one standard, one authority. And that realization landed squarely on the desk of the most ambitious man in the new government, Alexander Hamilton.
Alexander Hamilton did not see the copper panic as a temporary disruption. He saw it as a warning shot. To Hamilton, money was not just a tool for commerce. It was the bloodstream of the nation. If it became corrupted, everything else would follow: law, order, sovereignty, even morality. And in 1789, the bloodstream was poisoned. Hamilton had just taken office as the first Secretary of the Treasury. The position itself was barely defined. There were no institutions, no precedents, no safety nets. The United States existed on paper. Financially, it was still a collection of improvisations and failures. The copper panic clarified something Hamilton had feared all along. If the federal government could not control the money, it could not control the country. He understood what many others still resisted. The panic was not an accident. It was the logical outcome of a fragmented system. When states outsourced minting to private actors, they created a race to the bottom. Every mint had the same incentive: use less metal, strike more coins, push them out faster than competitors. Fraud was not a deviation. It was the business model. Hamilton also understood the political danger. The anti-federalists were watching closely. They had warned that centralized power would become tyrannical. Now the new government faced a different accusation: incompetence. The humiliation of New York mattered. This wasn't a distant frontier crisis. This was the capital of the United States. Foreign diplomats were forming opinions in real time about whether the American experiment was viable, and the answer, stamped in copper, looked bleak. Hamilton moved deliberately. In private letters and public arguments, he framed the copper panic not as a scandal, but as evidence, proof that monetary sovereignty could not be divided,
proof that money had to be national, standardized, and enforced with authority. This was not a popular argument. Many Americans still associated centralized financial power with British control. They remembered royal mints, taxes, and monopolies. To Hamilton's critics, his proposal sounded like a return to tyranny. But Hamilton had reality on his side. Bread riots are persuasive. In 1791, Hamilton presented his report on the establishment of a mint to Congress. It was not merely a technical proposal, it was a declaration of monetary philosophy. Hamilton argued that money must be simple, uniform, and trusted. He proposed abandoning the confusing British system of pounds, shillings, and pence in favor of a decimal system, dollars and cents. This idea had been discussed before. Thomas Jefferson had supported it years earlier, but Hamilton transformed it into policy. A rational system for a rational republic. More importantly, Hamilton proposed defining money by weight, a specific amount of gold and silver, not promises, not state discretion, physical reality. No guessing, no local variations, no private shortcuts. Money would be law. The memory of the copper panic hung over every debate. No one needed to mention Thomas Machen by name. Everyone remembered the gutters filled with pennies, the hungry laborers, the frozen markets. When Congress finally passed the Coinage Act of 1792, it did so with a severity that shocks modern readers. The act created a national mint. It established the dollar as the unit of account. It standardized coin weights and compositions, and then it did something extraordinary. Section 19 declared that if any officer of the mint debased the currency by stealing metal, adding excess alloy, or falsifying coinage, they would suffer death. The death penalty for debasing money. This was not theatrical. It was trauma written into law. The founders did not view currency debasement as a white-collar crime. They saw it as theft of labor, as violence against the poor, as an attack on the legitimacy of the republic itself.
They were determined that it would never happen again. The construction of the Federal Mint in Philadelphia became the first major infrastructure project of the United States government. It was the first federal building erected under the Constitution. The message was unmistakable. Money came before almost everything else. The man chosen to lead the mint was not a politician or a banker. He was a scientist. David Rittenhouse was one of the most respected intellectual figures in America, an astronomer, mathematician, and instrument maker. This choice was deliberate. After Machen's mills, trust had to be rebuilt from zero. The public needed to believe that the people in charge of money were precise, restrained, and incorruptible. Even with these precautions, the scars of the panic were still raw. When the mint released its first circulating coins in 1793, the reaction was unexpectedly hostile. The coin, later known as the chain cent, featured a circle of linked chains on the reverse. The design was meant to symbolize unity and strength. The public hated it. The chains reminded people of bondage, of control, of oppression. In a nation still traumatized by a monetary collapse, symbolism mattered. Within weeks, the design was scrapped and replaced. It was a small episode, but it revealed something essential. Trust, once broken, is fragile. The federal government could not simply declare the old state coppers invalid. That would have erased what little wealth remained among the poor. Instead, officials began a slow, painful process of demonetization. Old Vermont and New Jersey coppers could be exchanged for new federal cents, but not at face value, only at their weight in metal. Thanks to years of debasement, that weight was minimal. The final cost of the copper panic was paid not by speculators or counterfeiters, but by ordinary citizens who held the coins. The government effectively defaulted on the old state currencies to launch the new federal one. It was a necessary evil. The cleanup took years. Markets did not stabilize overnight. Confidence returned slowly.
transaction by transaction. By the mid-1970s, the economy finally settled around the new dollar. Machin's coins faded from circulation, melted down into tools, bells, and scrap. But the lesson remained burned into the American consciousness. Money was not a product of the free market. It was a creature of the law. And when the law stepped back, chaos rushed in. The United States survived its first financial crisis, but it survived as a different country. Before the copper panic, money had been local, improvised, and negotiable. After it, money became centralized, standardized, and guarded like a weapon. The Republic learned that monetary chaos was not just an inconvenience, it was a threat to legitimacy itself. And that lesson would echo for centuries. By the mid-1970s, the worst was over. Markets functioned again. Wages could buy food. Trust, cautiously, began to return. The dollar, defined by law, regulated by a national mint, and backed by the authority of the federal government, had survived its violent birth. But the copper panic left scars that never fully healed. For thousands of working Americans, the crisis did not end with recovery. It ended with loss. Jars of pennies collected through honest labor were exchanged at a discount or quietly written off. Order was restored, but restitution was not. The government had chosen the future over the past. That choice would echo for generations. The penny survived the panic, but it was no longer innocent. From the very beginning, America's smallest unit of money existed in tension between usefulness and worth, symbolism and reality. When the first federal cents entered circulation in 1793, they were massive, heavy, made of pure copper.
You could feel their value in your hand. This was not accidental. The size made counterfeiting expensive. The weight made debasement obvious. Honesty was engineered into the metal itself. But time is relentless. As the American economy expanded, the purchasing power of a cent declined, slowly but persistently. Inflation worked quietly, year after year. What once bought bread eventually bought almost nothing. The penny faced a familiar problem. Its metal was becoming more valuable than its purpose. By the mid-1800s, producing a large copper cent cost more than the coin was worth. The same economic pressure that Thomas Machine had exploited now confronted the federal government itself. In 1857, the United States quietly abandoned the large cent in favor of a smaller coin. It was lighter, cheaper, less honest, but more practical. The public accepted it. They usually do. Over the decades, the cycle repeated. As copper prices rose and the dollar weakened, the penny shrank. Metal content declined. What had once been a solid piece of copper slowly became something else. In 1982, the transformation became explicit. The penny stopped being copper in any meaningful sense. It became zinc with a thin copper coating, a coin that looked familiar but wasn't what it claimed to be. The irony is uncomfortable. The very behavior that nearly destroyed the American economy in 1789, issuing money whose face value exceeded its intrinsic value, eventually became official policy. The government did what Machine had done. The difference was legality. Today, the penny costs more to produce than it is worth. Every one minted is a guaranteed loss. Many businesses refuse to accept them. Others round prices to the nearest nickel. The penny is dying again, not in a panic, in slow motion. And this brings us to the deeper lesson of the copper panic, one that extends far beyond 18th century copper. Money is not metal. It is not paper. It is not numbers on a screen. Money is trust, enforced by authority. When private actors control money, the incentive structure is always the same. Print more, cut corners, externalize the cost. Profits remain private. Losses spread outward. Thomas Machine did not invent this impulse. He simply industrialized it. That is why the copper panic still matters. Strip away the presses and acid barrels, and Machine's operation looks strangely modern.
He issued tokens. He promised stability. He failed to fully back that promise. When confidence collapsed, the value collapsed with it. The technology changes. The psychology does not. The temptation to create money without restraint is the original sin of finance. The panic also delivered an uncomfortable lesson about federalism. Money does not tolerate fragmentation. One permissive jurisdiction can undermine an entire system. One weak link invites contagion. The founders learned this the hard way when bad copper from one region flooded another. That memory still shapes policy today. Governments guard monetary sovereignty aggressively, not out of paranoia, but experience. They know that trust, once broken, is extraordinarily difficult to rebuild. But there is a darker side to this lesson. If trust is the real currency, it can be spent, and it can be exhausted. The people of New York trusted copper until it betrayed them. Then they trusted paper because they trusted the bank. Later generations trusted the federal dollar because they trusted the state. Today, we trust digital balances. Each system works until it doesn't. The copper panic forced America to grow up. It built institutions, hardened laws, created the dollar that would eventually dominate the world. But it also revealed a truth that never disappears. Money is only as strong as belief in it, and belief is fragile. By the time the panic ended, America had already changed forever. Before 1789, money had been local, improvised, and negotiable. After the panic, it became centralized, standardized, and guarded like a weapon. This wasn't an abstract lesson debated in pamphlets. It was learned by hungry families, by laborers who worked all day and still couldn't eat, by merchants who watched their livelihoods dissolve into piles of worthless metal. The panic burned a moral rule into the national memory. Debasing money is not a technical mistake. It is an act of violence against the poor. That belief shaped American policy for nearly a century. It explains why the Constitution restricted state money powers. It explains the severity of the Coinage Act. It explains the obsession with sound money that defined early American politics. Thomas Machen lived comfortably to the end of his life. When he died in 1816, his obituaries were polite. His role in nearly collapsing the economy faded into obscurity. But his ghost never left. It lingers in every argument about inflation, every debate over who should control money, every fear that the currency is being diluted just a little too much. The copper panic proved something unsettling. You don't have to destroy a nation with armies. Sometimes all it takes is a penny that lies.